Thank you, Evan. Now it is time for a general discussion as per usual, and I would like to open the floor for comments and questions. And as always, please keep your comments.
I was very, very interested in the presentation of Cristina Bogafogo, Philippine, and the others to speak of this subject of human trafficking. Maybe everyone knows that on 27 September, we have in the United Nations the session, the high-level session with the invitation of many presidents to speak about the human trafficking. And the meeting confirmed the priority of the global plan of action to combat human trafficking across the world. This is also the priority of Pope Francis, and it's also the priority of the Academy, because the Academy in these last 4 years worked because the Pope asked it, and we consider that this is a crime against humanity. So also this is in the OGS, in the objective of develop sustainable, and just in this point, 8.7. So I think that we need to be very concrete in this. We try to be concretely, and the Academy tried to convince the people. We invited leaders, politician leaders, judges, other part of the society, people, and continue to do this to convince about the problem, because really in all these 70 goals, this is a priority for the Academy, for the Pope, and also for the subject of this meeting, because the subject is fraternity, solidarity, and the more important question is to be solidar and brother with these people to suffer in the more tragic way for slavery, prostitution, traffic of organs. And I can say that we have recently traveled in China, and in China we find many things that in other countries we don't find today, in very important countries. So about climate change, agree with the COP21, but also about the human dignity, and have a program very interesting to eradicate traffic of organs, and also the other form of traffic, human traffic. So I want that we be very concrete in this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monsieur. Please.
Great presentation. I have a question, and my question is that there is a learning crisis in Africa and in the world. And when I talk about a learning crisis, I'm concerned about kids going to school and not learning. SDG number 4, target 1 is to ensure that by 2030, all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality education and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. But in Africa, it shows that 88% of children, adolescents, will get into adulthood without a basic proficiency in reading. Enrollment in primary education in developing countries has reached 91%, but still kids are not learning, and they are not staying in school. So it's a very difficult question. So my question to Professor Jeffrey Sachs is, how do we teach children how to learn? It might be a very difficult, and I don't know, in your role as the advisor to the UN Secretary General, are these some of the questions that bother him every day? Because if kids are in school, the MDGs where everybody should be in school. Now we are having everybody in school, but the kids are still not learning. So how do we teach How do we improve the learning crisis in Africa? Thank you.
Before we get to more complicated answers, there's a very basic problem, and that is that when the kids go to school, if they do go to school, there are no proper materials, there's no electricity, there's no water, there's no food, the teachers are not qualified, the classrooms have 60 kids in them. So it's not a huge mystery. It's tremendous poverty and a budget that is inadequate for this challenge. There are other issues as well, the multiple languages, the home language versus the language of instruction. But I think even before we get to esoteric problems, the problem of poverty is very great. And more than that, and linked to the poverty, enrollment is very different from attendance. So you register a child, but the child may not be there many days of the month. The teacher may not be there many days of the month. This is tragic and unnecessary, and it's related to basic economics. The basic economics are that a minimum cost of a decent classroom experience is about $300 per child per year. But what a poor country can manage is maybe $90 or $100 per child per year. Let me give you the basics are that African countries, if they really stretch, spend about 4% of GDP on education. 4% of a country at, say, $600 a year, 4% of GDP at $600 a year is $24. Take into account that the children are maybe 1/3 of the population, so multiply that by 3, you get $70 per child spending per year, so it's 24 times 3, $72. Very few African countries can come anywhere close to providing a budget on their own for what would be needed for a decent classroom experience, where there's one teacher for 25 or 30 kids, there's lighting, there's instruction manuals, there's a computer screen, there's running water, and there's something to eat during the day also, and toilets that are functioning. So this is like many problems. It's a problem, most importantly, of poverty. It's not the only problem, but it is mostly a problem of poverty. What do you need to do to overcome a problem of poverty? In the short term, you need to help, financial help. So the rich world ought to be helping to increase the amount of spending per person, per child, to make the education work better. They're not doing that. This is the indifference and the nastiness in the world. Almost every day I talk about this issue with someone of responsibility. I was in Brussels with the European Commission all day on Wednesday, and I spent 8 hours hearing myself talk about those numbers. And at one point they explained to me that education, it's not on the Commission's list of priorities right now. Well, I nearly pushed someone out the window, actually. So I would have been behind bars. I said, are you kidding? What could be on the Commission's list of priorities? What else is there if we're not helping the kids to get educated? So this is part of our struggle, and this needs to be understood. My hope is that the African leaders will establish a fund and call for participation in it, and that we will help to raise the funds for that from governments or from billionaires or from other companies that can contribute both in kind and in cash. There are so many creative things to do with education right now. We heard just last Monday, in fact, sitting where Sam is sitting, a presentation by the gentleman who heads a very innovative program in Uruguay using information technology for improving the quality of education in Uruguay. Every child gets a tablet. Every child is online. They're teaching English, but they don't have English teachers in the country, so the classes are conducted by live video with the Philippines, and the kids are learning English from native English speakers in very high quality. So we can do so many things right now that require modest resources, but can have a huge effect. It's impossible for a country to achieve anything without kids learning now. It's impossible to achieve anything without kids finishing secondary school. There's no future without a secondary school completion. Right now in Africa, only 1/3 of the kids are completing secondary school, and that means maybe 35% of boys and 25% of girls. 2/3, not even close. Some of those haven't learned very much, but 2/3, it's not even close to being a reality right now. But SDG 4 says universal secondary completion by 2030. My recommendation to the African leaders is that this January at the African Union Summit, they make a clear commitment to free upper secondary education for all children. They establish a fund for African secondary education. They call on partners, if there are partners, to do it. If there are not partners, they do the best they can out of the national resources and at least pledge to do that. My feeling is that there are at least some partners in the world. We want to mobilize billionaires who have together $8 trillion of net worth right now. $8 trillion of net worth. So 1% of that net worth is $80 billion. And that by itself could cover health and education for every child on the planet, just 1% of the net worth of all the billionaires in the world. So many of them would like to be more consequential with their wealth. If you're a billionaire, I'm told you don't know what to do with it anyway. How many yachts can you make? How many residences can you have? How many planes can you have? There's a limit. So they want to do something useful, many. And this is really important as well. So the answer is that at one level, it's not a huge mystery. Teachers should be trained. The number of students should be limited. The electricity, running water, safety of the environment, connectivity should be assured. The curriculum should be proper. And that's what we should work on very fast, very, very fast. To my mind, it's essential because every child that is lost right now to secondary school or to education in general, what are they going to do with their lives? What job are they going to do exactly? How are they going to find a place in their society? The agriculture jobs are not going to exist, by the way. They will be mechanized out of existence. Be sure of it. It's happening. That's why the cities are filled with people. Filled with people. And then with no skills, what to do. So we really need an answer to your question and to address the practical implications of that. And for the life of me, I don't understand how I can have these discussions day in, day out for the last 5 years and not have someone jump up and say, we do it. But it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. And I'm just going to keep pushing on my own, but we're an army that we're building for decency. We've got to carry the message out. I want the African leaders to lead, and then we can help to follow their lead. President Akufo-Addo of Ghana last month declared free upper secondary education, following through on a campaign pledge. This is a wonderful, very important breakthrough. Let's get all African leaders to pledge the same, but then to open their books and say, we can't afford that. We're just committed to it. You help us to match that. And then we're going to get the kids to learn, because all these wonderful devices, being able to be online, having a tablet to learn, having new curricula, there's so many interesting, fun, stimulating things that can change the real direction right now. But the status quo cannot. And I think that's the answer to the question, and you have to tell me how we're going to get it done. But that's what we need to do.
Wow, thank you, Professor. Please, Xenia.
Just something that, thank you, Professor, for that, and something that I was thinking about adding to, besides providing incentives for like free education for the kids, something that I've noticed is that the teachers are extremely underpaid and extremely unappreciated, which causes the problem of quality education. These kids are going to school, free education provided by the government, to learn from teachers who themselves are struggling, who themselves cannot take courses to learn more, who themselves cannot take courses to develop their own skills, changing skills that are constantly needed. And that is a big problem that we're facing in our society, is we're facing a problem of the lack of people to impart this knowledge to these kids that need to go to school. And that's the problem which we face with free education, is that the kids go to school, and then what Johanna said about not actually learning. Because the people who are in place to give them this knowledge are left behind. And they are desperately grappling for incentives as well. And they have a very, very, very difficult job. I myself have gone to the best, maybe, university, has a very good name in Mumbai, but in the classes, because of the system and the way it functions, the teachers don't have incentive to make our classes valuable enough for us. And this is something that we're constantly struggling with in India as well, which is not just free education, but quality education. And I think making the teachers a part of that conversation is really, really important. Having some sort of way to involve like the finances to go to them as like the next, they are the basis of what our countries are going to be in the future.
Let me read you from October 10. The headline is "Shock as 21,780 Kaduna teachers fail primary 4 exam."
Yeah.
About 21,780 out of 33,000 teachers failed the primary 4 test administered to test their competence by the Kaduna state government. That was the headline 4 days ago. So this is the situation. I've had this fight with Washington. You can tell I don't like Washington. I just don't like anything about Washington. It's an empire, it's greedy, it's gotten incredibly nasty over time, it spends unlimited sums on war, it won't spend a penny on peace. And when I noted, even in a report last year, they said there's no big financing gap in Africa. It's $100 per student. And I said, how can you write that in? He said, well, that's what they're doing right now. I said, is it working? Well, I don't know. They should improve the management of the system. It's a kind of evil. Really, it's a kind of evil. And it is not hard to understand. It's like when we were supposed to treat AIDS with no medicines. It's like when we're trying to treat malaria with no medicines. Nobody, I mean, a test for any person is, would you put your child in that school? And the answer is no, if you can afford not to. So this is clear, and we need, but it's also so stupid, it's so short-sighted. What's supposed to come out of all of this? Because a country can't function without an educated population. It cannot function, period. So this is really what we're up against. We're up against poverty and lack of interest, globalization of indifference. But we're going to overcome that. We're going to overcome it because when people know, when we put headlights on it, when we call attention to it, when we show a better way, people will join. But it cannot just go silently.
But Prof, the U.S. just came out from UNESCO.
Yeah.
They decided to quit. And I'm still trying to, grapple with the fact that they've left the only UN institute that is responsible for education. And coupled with the fact that, I was at the UN and the Global Partnership for Education is trying to rally $3.1 billion for education, especially education in emergencies. And countries like Denmark, stepped up. Countries with $16 million into the Education Cannot Wait Fund. But the problem now is countries that have been affected by war, there are about 35 countries. These countries cannot. They can't even take care of them own selves, and not to talk about putting their own kids in schools. So where does that incentive come from? If the world leaders are not there to support, and these countries themselves cannot raise money within their own national budget to fund education. So are we just going back and forth?
I don't think we know the answer yet, because we will be surprised when the answer comes. I don't know exactly where it's going to come from. I didn't know 17 years ago the funding for AIDS would come from George W. Bush. That was a big surprise. That was about the last place I expected it. So you never know. But you can't win this without advocating. And you can't give up. And the starting point is how rich the world is and how little this problem is financially. And so that's the starting point. We're not trying to mobilize an unbelievable sum. I just told you that 2,000 people giving 1% of their net worth could solve this problem. 2,000. So maybe we go door to door to them. Why not? That would only take us a week or two. Of course, we'd only get up to the gates, but they'd have to let us in. But there are plenty of people in Mumbai also to talk to, and in other places, and in Lagos and elsewhere. So we're going to do this, really. We really are going to do this. But where the answer is, I'm not sure.
As a reference, I just wanted to say that these individuals that we refer to are listed on the Forbes list. Their address is probably not there, but I'm sure you can somehow find their email addresses. But we should talk more about that in some of the other sessions.
Thanks. I'd like to move to this part of the audience. Please Adam.
Hi. I was just kind of thinking a little bit about, Iman, your kind of talk about the SDGs in education. I was sort of wondering, when trying to work towards the SDGs and educate people about the SDGs, we often look to the work that people have already done. And I was sort of thinking about this when you were speaking, in that there's a very harsh climate towards failure when trying to come up with solutions and whatnot. But sort of knowing about how other programs have gone wrong and what other people have done, I think can really inform the work that I may want to do or others may want to do. And I know myself in the initiative that I'm working on this summer, we've certainly made a fair share of mistakes that I think when talked about, others could learn from as well. And recognizing that, I'm sort of wondering about how can a climate that is good for I guess, being able to highlight the mistakes that people have made and being able to use that in a constructive manner be created. And I think that could be very, very helpful in terms of working towards the SDGs.
Anyone from the bottom, please?
Yeah, regarding the learning from mistakes part, and in general, I mean, several businesses, international businesses, came from, and entrepreneurs came from failed businesses. Failure is not defeat. Failure makes an individual stronger. And pulling in the resource center or whatever, the experiences of failure and how we are combating it, how we are falling 6 times but rising 7 times, that's what that's all about. And sharing different ideas and different ways and means on how to address such failure, but also what Dr. Betsy Parker said, celebrating the success stories as well. And that would mean empowering the other individuals.
Thanks, Eman. We've got about 10 minutes left, so try to stay really short. Please.
My question is for Eman. It was a really good presentation. I didn't know that much about your country before, so except for the conjoined twins. Yeah. But my question is about the Pride walk instead of having a diversity walk instead of Pride.
Sorry, can you speak up? We can't hear you.
Sorry. My question was about replacing the Pride walk with a diversity walk and why the reason for that was.
So to speak generally, the LGBT community also secludes itself within the general community. We have this labyrinth of seeking acceptance and wanting to be equals, but however, when we organize activities, and I say we on purpose, it's secluding ourselves. So that would create an image that we tend to be to a certain stereotype. I mean, I'm not sure about you all, but I am a gay man and I don't fit that stereotype, and that's why the Pride March, I believe, is not it does good in validating what we are. However, the Diversity March would point out, as I stated, walking the streets of the people with the people. So you would have a Muslim youth, an LGBT youth, a disabled man, the other religions, etc., all walking together and sending a message that yes, there is, as one of my colleagues mentioned, a climate change march, or trade unions doing their own protest, but why not collectively lobby together and make our voice stronger? And that's why a diversity march, to really not leave anyone behind. So because we often, as I mentioned in the presentation, find it very easy to seclude ourselves within our own networks, but not look within helping each other out. So the Diversity March would seek to break that barrier.
Thanks. Thank you.
In relation with education in Africa, I agree with the problem, but I heard the other day from President Prodi, that have a foundation special to help Africa in general, that today 80% of the money of the great capital in Africa come from China. So if we want to do something really to change, we need to work with China. And today, China, And today China follow Laudato Si and try to respect the human dignity. So we are not only United States, that is a very important country, but we have other countries that are more and more important, and the situation is in develop. So I think that we need to really to have a brick with China and the European countries in China, or the other countries to have in the same line.
You see, I said I didn't know where it was going to come from, and then 2 minutes later, we got the answer. That's part of the mystery.
Thank you, Monsignor. There's Gabriella on the left, and then Molly.
Thank you very much. I would like to briefly share a bit an experience with some projects that can develop in the point of how to go about education. As Professor Sachs was saying, in the political perspective, solving the problem of education in Africa is extremely complex. But in my experience, I've seen that appropriate technologies and the building of capacities with the African people can really help. With appropriate technologies, I mean, for example, investing in solar technologies can help a kid to, instead of having to breathe the smokes of kerosene lamps, to be able to read at night. That's a way to start. And we can make use of, for example, the fact that in Africa, the mobile network is one of the most spread and developed in the world. Surprisingly, that's why it's so important for the economy of the continent. And on speaking about the development of capacities, this summer I had the enormous chance of going to Ethiopia for a small period of time. And I visited a school in which they had in place a project of education related to menstruation. So what they did, the organization that was working in Wukra, in the north of Ethiopia, they stayed in the school for approximately 4 years, and they educated kids in classrooms and the teachers to help the people break the stigmas in menstruation. And the results were amazing. The drop-off of girls in elementary school due to menstruation went from over 80% to 0% in 4 years. So you're educating people, and you are allowing that knowledge, that capacity goes on for a really long time. So there's not just one single answer, but again, the creation of knowledge, science, and appropriate technologies really can help. Thank you.
Molly?
Thank you so much. I have a question for everyone on this panel. It was so interesting to me to see Gabriella talk about Bbox, which is a for-profit company, if I understand correctly. And then we had Maria talk about a religious nonprofit. And then we had Kevin talk about a government implementing the SDGs. And then we had other examples of government and nonprofit partnerships with Thersa and Darshatha talking about a more traditional secular NGO, at least from what I understood. I'm really interested in learning what you think are the benefits of implementing the SDGs through these different business models and the potential shortfalls, and which SDGs you think might fit better, or which kind of situations are more appropriate for these different business models or approaches to organizations.
There's one basic thing to keep in mind, which is that anything that is a business, whether social business or for-profit business, is beyond the financing capacity of the bottom half of the population in a poor country. So that's why public financing is very important. There's a difference between public financing and institutional delivery. For example, a poor country that is going to pay for something may say, we won't run it, but we will hire someone to run it. That can be a good strategy for creating more innovation, for testing different models, for going with an innovative company. Liberia, for example, is saying to private providers of education, we'll provide the budget, you provide the services, because our public system isn't working. What doesn't work is the idea that leave it to the social business or the private sector alone, because poor people are really poor. And in a low-income setting, there are people almost with no cash income of any kind. There are some business models. I met a very impressive team recently working in the slums in Kenya that is providing schooling for a low number. I asked how many kids are in the class. It's about 70. Well, you can already start to see they have a huge classroom, a very specific, narrow or regimented focus to keep costs down. I was impressed by their commitment. They were trying to make it compatible with the reach of the local households, but I said it should be 3 times that. They said, we're the first to agree, but they can't afford it. So they're not a solution by themselves. They're trying to meet the local budget constraint of the household, but that's not a solution. That's why in rich countries, the public sector pays for these things. It's only in very poor countries that the rich countries say, let the private sector do it. That's why. And one should really understand, it comes back to what Tony was saying earlier. The libertarian mentality, which is that you're on your own, is a disease of America. It's a disease of rich and powerful people who say, I made it on my own. Oh, I inherited a few $100 million, but I made it on my own. And so you should make it on your own also. It's a psychological debility. And America has guided the IMF and the World Bank for a long time, and it infused these horrible ideas. Now the IMF is pulling away from that. The World Bank was told by Steve, fly me to my honeymoon Mnuchin, that they should wean themselves off of the public funds. Well, so should he. What a despicable human being. But he said to the World Bank yesterday, why don't you wean yourself off of public funds? Well, why don't you fly commercial, Mr. Mnuchin? Really? But that's the American rich, entitled mentality. Don't buy into it. And so the private sector or social companies can do lots of innovative things, but they cannot provide education for free. They cannot provide health care for free. There's no magic in this. A teacher needs to make several $1,000s a year if they're going to have gone through university. If not, you get 21,000 teachers that failed the 4th grade. So this is real. This is the only place economics comes in, that I'm telling you there's no way to do this for free. So my strong advice is don't be poor. And my second advice is if you are rich, help the poor. But on that, I'm just quoting Matthew 25. This is the first point. And we're going to make the message of decency work. And that's why when you are the ambassadors, you also have to speak this truth. And it's why Jesus said it also. Not on a whim, but because the poor really need the help. That's why he said it. And that's part of our message. And we're going to go to China to say it.
Thank you. Just two more very quick comments or questions. Clayton, I know you've been holding your hand for a while, please.
Thanks. This is a question for Professor Sachs. In thinking about the future of education, when we raise this money globally that we need for the reform, where would you put it? Many people have a different view of what exactly education is. Is the solution brick and mortar schools with solar panels on them, or is the solution bringing Google Fiber to communities and having everyone have one of these things?
My own advice, strong, real advice, is that you put the money in a fund that is based in Africa, if it's for African schools, that is administered by African leaders together with partners, and you let nations decide that answer, not from here. And this is how AIDS is being controlled right now. The way that it's done, just in 1 minute, is that the government convenes what is called a country coordination mechanism. Get the leading civil society around the table, get the government officials around the table, brainstorm on a common plan, and then submit it to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Have that plan reviewed by an expert group for consistency, for arithmetic, for credibility. If it passes muster, whether it's by this or by classroom or generally by a blend, fund it, and then monitor and evaluate it and learn over time. Don't impose it from the outside. Let the government have the lead, but not the exclusive voice, so that civil society is around the table as a built-in part of the mechanism, and then give trust, but then also monitor so that the money's not stolen. In the Global Fund, 1 out of every many programs, the money was stolen, and then an investigation was done, the person was thrown out, and the program then continued. So this is a business proposition in this sense, that you have to be serious about the use of money, that it has to fulfill what the commitments are. And also there's learning. My own view is don't give up on schools. Schools have a lot of merit. Since the Lyceum 2,300 years ago, schools have been doing pretty well. We use them, again, I look to what rich people do. They send their kids to school in general. It's a good indication of what a standard is when the budget constraint is not a standard. And then I would definitely try to use the new technologies. And a lot of interchange about best practice is really important. The gentleman that was sitting there that heads the Plan Ceibal of Uruguay had a lot of very creative ideas. And when we have a meeting next week on education here, I'm going to make sure that he is Skyped in and can tell us about that as well. So the answer is no one answer. Really, it's a question of subsidiarity, which allow these solutions to come from the ground up, but to meet the funding from the top down.
Yeah, and I think to have access to that funding with reporting and monitoring of it should be mandatory.
Of course it is. Don't hand over money without following up, ever. Yeah.
One final comment, Khalid.
Hi, thank you for your really, really inspiring talks as well, by the way. This is a question actually which you kind of touched upon, Professor Sachs, about the money being siphoned out of funds by illicit individuals. Also, what can be done with the private sector within developing countries to prevent such illicit transfers being done? What can be done for transparency to ensure that money is going to the right places within governmental positions? And then secondly, about the Diversity March, I am really, really down for that, and it sounds absolutely incredible, and I think it's something that we can all join on board of and try and make a reality. So yeah, let's talk about it and let's make it happen.
Let me tell you one quick story. In 2000, when I recommended a global fund to fight AIDS, people said, what will happen? The money will get stolen, it can't be used, you can't do X, Y, and Z. I recommended also giving away bed nets, and all my colleagues in academia said, no, the bed nets will be stolen, they'll be used for wedding veils, they'll be used for fishing nets, and so forth. I was also told repeatedly that poor people don't like anything, it won't value anything that's just given to them, they have to buy it. The opposite of rich people, obviously, who like things that are given to them, like Air Force One jets and things like that. So, turned out the bed nets, for example, for malaria were given out. Malaria came down very heavily in Africa. And so a group of academics went to do a study. And they were shocked to find that when they went and did a survey of households, the nets were actually there. So they were deeply puzzled. They actually wrote in this study, we were told that there were such agency problems that, of course, the nets wouldn't be there. So we're very puzzled. Then they study this difficult, complicated question, and they come up with the idea of a concept of socially directed motivation, that maybe the health workers cared more than about themselves. Well, this was a great enlightenment for the economists, a concept that they hadn't heard of before, apparently. And it was definitely worthy of a good working paper. But don't worry so much about this issue. Actually, people would like their kids in school. They really would. And the parents would like to make sure the schools function. And in most places, the politicians would be happy if there was a way to get funding for the schools to really work. And the parliamentarians wouldn't mind it either. And that's even in places where you don't like that class too much because they're not, scintillating in their performance. So I think this is an exaggerated problem. Of course, I'm all for monitoring, for evaluation, but what I am for is creating a community of interest with professionals around it, whether it's health workers or teachers, that say we're scaling up. Teachers like to teach. And they'd like to have a schoolroom with a light bulb, running water, 30 kids in class rather than 80. So I wouldn't exaggerate this problem. People don't want to always do the wrong thing. Those that do, we call them sociopaths. Once in a while, they become president. But other than that, it's actually only 1 or 2% of the population. It's a very rare attribute. It's a clinical diagnosis that is rare. And we shouldn't assume the worst all the time. We should be prepared for the better. We should have enough monitoring to avoid the worst, but not everybody is sociopathic.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to wrap up. We are running over time. Thanks, everyone, and please join me in thanking the panel.
Is this the final question? Is there a dinner tonight? Is there a dinner tonight?
And I'll pass the final word to Sam.
I'm going to let Sam have the final word, but you have a dinner tonight all together. Okay. I want you guys to plan. You'll enjoy the dinner doing that. But I want you to brainstorm for what you're going to do as a group so that tomorrow we really hear an action plan. Okay? So consider yourselves a global force. A global force for the SDGs. What are you going to do? What do you need? How are you going to operate? How are you going to get organized? Okay? Assume that there are some resources available for you, because there will be. Don't assume unlimited resources. I don't mean resources for carrying your programs. I mean resources for you to act as a corporate body, to be young people leading the SDGs and connecting with others. So please use tonight to brainstorm so that tomorrow we see by the late afternoon a plan from you. Okay? Not from me, not from us, but from you, to say, here's what we can do. Don't forget campuses, don't forget cities, don't forget mobilization, don't forget public awareness, don't forget outreach. But this is in your hands, okay? And tomorrow we'll discuss, so don't expect it's finalized 9 a.m. or 9 p.m. tonight or 11 p.m. tonight. But this is dinner homework, okay? Have a nice dinner.
Sorry, if I may just, thank you. Just to expand on that, and in terms of the, I would like to point out a couple of tools that you might find useful in your discussions, and I will certainly join you for those talks, is please take a look at the Sdg University's guide, which is something that was done by STS in Australia Pacific as a way to get started with the SDGs in universities and campuses, which is part of the task that we've been given. The other one to look at is the SDG Cities Guide, and again, this is how to get started with the SDGs in cities and human settlements around the world. And two other digital resources that you might find useful is the SDG Index. Go and find your country, where it sits on the SDG Index, where are the gaps, and how we can address those. And as I said before, Anastasia has done a wonderful data visualization, so you can go and play around with the data, but this really helps you understand where your country sits. And finally, to just wrap up the talk, in fact, I don't have the final words, I would like to give it to the wonderful STSN Youth Campus Coordinator, Sienna, to finish it up, and then we'll go for dinner.
Hey everyone, I know that you're really hungry, so just stay with me for a few minutes. I promise it'll be brief. Before we finish tonight, I just want to tie it back into our larger theme of fraternity, which the Pontifical Academy of Sciences has tasked us with. To start out, I want to share a brief story that highlights what community and fraternity means to me. When I was 5 years old, my mom was diagnosed with kidney failure, a disease which Obina talked about earlier, and he talked about the healthcare access problems with dialysis. It was really hard for me as a young child with my sister, who's younger than I, to see what my mom had to go through. For several years, she asked family members, friends, if they could donate their kidney. Unfortunately, none of them were a match. So she spent 3 years on a wait list waiting for a kidney. And things were getting to the point where she was still so far down on the list that she privately to herself, obviously not to us since we were children, but she started to lose a little bit of hope and faith. So what she decided to do was she posted in our Catholic Church's bulletin board a notice explaining her situation and that she needed a kidney. Complete strangers. We went to a very large Catholic church, so we didn't know very many people, but within a week, a woman named Rose reached out to her and said, I'd be more than happy to give you my kidney if I'm a match. Rose went through the testing, she was a match with my mom, and a few months later, she successfully donated her kidney to my mother. This past year, my mom celebrated her 10th anniversary of her successful kidney transplant, and she is 100% healthy to this day. That to me is what, first of all, Catholic community means, and what our general and larger human community needs to be. Are we willing to give to the point where we would give of ourselves? Obina also asked, what is the value of life? Are we willing to give this life to others? Are we willing to give life to the SDGs? Another really important aspect of this is that I learned, and my mom also learned through this process, that you should never be afraid to ask for help. She asked a complete stranger to donate an organ, and they said yes. Imagine what you can do if you go to those corporations and you ask for a grant. It's just money. You're not asking them for a kidney. There are people who are going to help you. We just have to find them and ask them these questions. I have learned so much from all of you today. I have pages of notes here, and I'm planning to create a Google document tonight to synthesize everything that I've learned. I would like us all, if you want to collaborate on that, please let me know and we can share it and we can make sure that everyone is able, we can synthesize all of our information together. Let's make this information accessible. If some of you want to help me translate it, let's make sure that this information is available to everyone. So not just us as participants learn from this experience, but everyone. So let's do that during dinner. Let's do that tonight at our hotel. Let's just get started and hit the ground running. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sienna, for sharing that wonderful story. And I would, going after such wonderful speeches from Jeff Sachs and everyone else, but also all of you, it's very hard to finish it off. But I can do something, and I think it will give it a nice run for it, and which is bon appetit. So.